Welcome to St. Peter's College. This is a state debating team grade debate on the topic that we should use military intervention to deliver emergency aid in humanitarian crises. The affirmative is from the state team, the negative is also from the state team. My name is Shiva Mukherjee, there is no timekeeper or adjudicator. There will be a warning knock at 1 minute and 5 minutes. Points of information may only be offered between these knocks. There will be a final knock of 2 knocks at 6 minutes. I ask that all mobile phones be turned off or on silent, and I call the first affirmative, Xander Grice.
When the world was on fire with conflict and natural disasters, where NGOs and the United Nations had proved fundamentally ineffective throughout history at relieving suffering, and when people with the ability to help stood idly by, it became abundantly clear that something had to be done. 3 points for you today at first affirmative. Firstly, why foreign governments had a moral obligation to do everything in their power to minimise suffering. Secondly, why militaries were uniquely placed to deliver emergency aid in man-made humanitarian crises. And lastly, why militaries were uniquely placed to deliver emergency aid in natural disasters. But before that, a point of setup. So, we as the affirmative team bring to you tonight a model where we would see foreign governments sending militaries to aid in humanitarian crises of all varieties. 2 examples of what we think this could look like. We think this could look like the US defending a no-fly zone over the Ukraine. And secondly, the United Kingdom's military providing support to the Nepalese people after earthquakes as 2 examples. So, what do we as the affirmative team think humanitarian crises are characterised by? We think they largely look like cases of large-scale, widespread human suffering, be this as the result of a man-made crisis like a war or a terrorist insurgency, or perhaps a natural disaster, be it an earthquake, a tsunami, or a flood. These are what we think humanitarian crises look like, and these are where we think that something has to be done by militaries. So then, what do we think emergency aid provided by militaries looks like? No, thank you. We think they look like measures to relieve suffering provided by direct military means. This could look like the defence of hospitals in an active war zone, or the use of military resources to help with earthquake recovery. So, with that out of the way, we're going to my first piece of substantive for you tonight, which is why foreign governments had a moral obligation to do everything in their power, and I'll take you in a minute, to minimise suffering. But first,
what are these military resources that would help specifically in an earthquake?
Okay, so I'm going to get to that later, but we think that militaries have an incredibly high capacity to assist in these situations due to their incredibly high training in terms of amphibious troops, which are uniquely held by militaries. We also think that they're at the forefront of robotics, developing pieces of equipment such as very small robots which can actually go through rubble, which is technology uniquely held by the United States military and not available to non-for-profit organisations. So, back to this idea of why foreign governments had a moral obligation to do everything in their power to minimise suffering. First thing to note here is that militaries have a unique type of agency because they're designed to be instantaneously deployable. This is the fundamental purpose of a military, is it's ready to go at a moment's notice in a way which the United Nations just wasn't. The United States military had to be prepared for any type of nuclear attack or any type of attack the Russian forces may launch at a moment's notice. No, thank you. And this was unique to militaries. We also thought that they had the agency to react to situations other than direct military threats, and we thought that they definitely should. The second thing to look at here is the capacity of foreign militaries. And there are really, 2 key things to note here. Firstly, they were designed for tough situations. As I mentioned in response to a POI earlier, they have amphibious forces which can, work over land and sea, something which we just didn't think the United Nations had access to. We also thought that they had the ability to work and operate in rubble and war zones in the sense that you couldn't just drive a car through a washed-away road. And the second thing here is that we thought they were incredibly well-resourced. We point to the US budget being 50 times that of NASA, and we also thought that they had millions of soldiers at their disposal, simply resources which no other group ever had. No, thank you. And we also thought that this principle and this moral obligation to minimise suffering existed regardless of the efficacy, because militaries were the only groups capable of providing this vitally important support. There were people driving in droves, and this meant that this existed irrespective of the efficacy of such a thing. Something simply had to be done. So, moving on to why militaries were uniquely placed to deliver emergency aid in humanitarian crises. The first thing to have a look at here is what exactly do we think these types of conflicts, which were likely to bring rise to man-made humanitarian crises, looked like. And we thought there were 3 characteristics. Firstly, they were asymmetric. In the case where they were symmetric, they were highly unlikely to cause humanitarian crises. Secondly, we thought they were incredibly drawn out. We pointed to the Ukraine war, which is ongoing. We point to the Ethiopian war, which has been ongoing for a decade. And we point to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been going since the end of World War II. The last thing to note here is that this meant an insane amount of death. When you had conflicts spanning decades. You had millions and millions of people dying. We'd also like to point out that this huge amount of death didn't necessarily come as a result of being a drawn-out conflict. We point to the Rwandan genocide here as an excellent example where the world stood idly by as millions and millions of people were murdered by their neighbours in under 30 days. This is an excellent example of why we needed military support. The second thing to look at under this point is the capacity of the military, and there were really 4 things here to note. They were designed for tough situations, they were battle-ready, they were trained in combat, and they had the capacity to do whatever it takes, and I'll take you in a second. And this was something which is incredibly unique to militaries. It wasn't something possessed by non-for-profit organisations. They were the only group capable of providing this incredibly important support.
Why did having guns make you better equipped to deal with a tsunami?
This is not a point about tsunamis. This is a point about you heading in to the middle of Ukraine to defend their hospitals and to provide humanitarian aid to these people who are being murdered in their droves, to civilians dying to cluster bombs. This is what we're talking about. We didn't fundamentally think that, a non-profit organisation had the capacity to operate under these circumstances. So this brings me on perfectly to what I'm talking about next, which is the failure of every other alternative. NGOs, as I just mentioned, are untrained in combat and unable to defend hospitals as is so desperately required. The United Nations fundamentally detracted from the response of other countries. They were underfunded and often vetoed by the Security Council. So, on this last piece of substantive regarding why militaries were uniquely placed to deliver emergency aid in natural disasters, the first thing to note here is that the governments in these places of natural disasters were absolutely crippled and unable to provide support and to end the suffering alone, largely because huge amounts of their infrastructure had been wiped out. We also thought that we thought there were 4 key things of these disasters. The first of which, they had a huge loss of life and they wiped out key infrastructure. This led to a diminished capacity for a successful domestic response, and it also meant that the sites of this disaster were inaccessible due to rubble and flooding. So this meant that militaries were really required, with their incredible degree of technology and ability to act under difficult circumstances, to relieve this suffering in a way which NGOs and the United Nations simply couldn't, for reasons provided to you throughout this speech. And it is for these reasons and the unique placement of militaries that it was so vitally important that they responded to these natural disasters, and why we are so proud to propose.
In reality, unlike what opposition just told you, enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine resulted in direct combat and thousands more dead. Defending a hospital with hundreds of soldiers placed a target on that hospital. These did nothing to minimise suffering. 4 questions for you today, 2 responsive, but first, 2 points of setup. So, our alternate mechanism for helping these countries was through providing monetary aid and support to foreign governments or charities such as the UN or the Red Cross. So this looks like Australia is still playing a role through this aid, just a less active one that was less likely to create escalating conflict. We think this debate concerns foreign military intervention. We were fine for countries to deploy their militaries within their own countries, for instance like Australia, using military during the floods within Australia. This wasn't within the scope of this debate. So, 2 things in response to the opposition's case. Firstly, how well set up militaries actually are in regards to humanitarian crises, and secondly, minimising suffering. So the opposition tried to get up here and assert the military has unique capabilities and agency to act in regard to non-military crises and situations. We disagree with this for 2 reasons. First, we thought the militaries were, and these commandments were responsible to people that were higher up in the system. Maybe they had to ask for permission before they acted specifically, and they had less agency because of that. But secondly, because we thought the militaries in the first place weren't set up for this. No, thank you. They weren't set up to hand out with volunteering or handing out specific supplies and resources to people in these countries. Organisations like the Red Cross or other charities who are currently acting in Ukraine without causing escalating conflict are the ones best suited to deal with this. But secondly, on this point of minimising suffering, no, thank you. Not only did opposition have a practically contingent principle when they talked about how they minimise suffering because it relied on them being able to prove they actually did that, which they don't, they were actually more likely to escalate the crisis. Note that they say that their motive for intervening in the first place is to stop conflicts that are drawn out, but historically, intervention is only likely to prolong this further. We point to examples like in Haiti, where the UN originally intervened with a special aid from the US, had strong military force. It was originally seen as a success for about a year, and that became a very prolonged process because Haiti was so reliant on the support they had from the US. Similar situations also happened in Iraq. We think that these situations seem to resolve originally but only cause instability in these countries later down the track.
What information?
On to my principal point on the role of the Australian military. We think that the Oz military serves in a strictly military capacity. Their role is to protect the population. That was why we were happy for them to help with New South Wales floods and fires in Victoria. But the military didn't have the responsibility to step in and intervene in foreign countries, especially when that involved delivering emergency aid. That was not the military's role. Even in Australia, the military isn't the main resolver of conflict. They simply aid, for instance, in border protection.
What information?
And I'll tell you in a second, yes.
If Australia had no obligation to provide military aid, why did the obligation specifically have to be monetary aid?
Okay, so we think that through monetary aid, you don't create the same conflict because you're providing it to organisations that are, firstly, better equipped to actually provide that kind of aid, less likely to cause escalation because they're not an official country that Russia can say, declare war with or fight against. But secondly, we thought that in general is less likely to harm people because you weren't sending in soldiers with the power to kill civilians. Okay, so even in Australia, for the Australian military to overstep and try and assert control within other countries, that this would not be taken well. Imagine Australia going into Fiji and trying to help with a flood crisis, but instead of aiding, they're trying to assert their dominance over the Fijian military, and this would not be taken well because they don't understand the language, they don't understand the cultural practices. So we think the intervention failed on two roles. Firstly, it intervened where it shouldn't, and secondly, it delivered services it wasn't intended to. On to my other point on why this increases our military's interventionism. In opposition's world, the military becomes far more interventionist, and we see this for two reasons. Firstly, because they're required to, but secondly, it also becomes generally more expected that when Australia is constantly intervening in humanitarian crises, it becomes expected they also step in other situations where they might not necessarily have to. So not only were the military being deployed in every humanitarian crisis, it was also being dispersed into situations like the coup in Myanmar. Why was this harmful? Firstly, it meant that each situation became poorly addressed by military because the military had limited capabilities. They were therefore going to be deploying across the world and therefore less effective and less strong and decisive. So,
Information.
why did more conflicts escalate? For instance, in Ukraine, as I told you in my pre-strike, a no-fly zone would mean that the Russian forces were now directly competing against Australian forces because that's how you enforce a no-fly zone. This means that Australia is at conflict with Russia. It's very problematic because Russia has more nuclear capabilities than we do. It escalates conflict. It's only going to cause more issues. We think it also sees things like tariffs between countries become more likely. By definition, more interactions between militaries means more probability of conflict, yes.
Where do you stand on the Rwandan genocide?
Okay, we think that the Rwandan genocide is unique in that the UN didn't have the specific capabilities that they needed to deploy and actually aid as we would have under our situation. When we're deploying the UN in the future, there's been policy changes that mean they can now act, not just in aiding when someone is injured or aiding when someone's in their care, but they can actually attack. That is the UN. So it's different to Australia becoming embroiled in that conflict, very different situations. So why else was interventionism bad? Because firstly, you don't have the language and customs and you're not equipped to deal with it. But secondly, spend more government money. We would far prefer to direct this money towards charities, for instance with Doctors Without Borders, who are equipped to deal with this in the first place. Okay, so why were the other mechanisms more effective? Firstly, they had strong capability of governments to deliver their own aid. Secondly, they also had large-scale services in the absence of this, like the UN and the Red Cross, or further, small local organisations like NGOs that can provide support. And why were these services better than the military? Two reasons. First, they were more likely to have cultural awareness. For instance, the organisations that have been working in these countries for decades know the practices and norms and are accustomed to what is acceptable. But secondly, they have pre-established links within this country. The Australian military has to arrive and set up bases and access to resources. These organisations have pre-established bases and connections to locals. They know the incentives and desires of the population better and are more likely to stay and maintain stability past the point of the conflict, which the Australian government does not have the resources to do, leaving these countries unstable without a relying country to help them. So, in finishing, these people won't view the military as approachable and they'll also cause more conflict. They do not aid the opposition's principle of minimising conflict.
Ladies and gentlemen, opposition ignores our analysis on why we stand for military deployment when they tell us guns won't solve natural disasters like tsunamis. We tell you military intervention looks like soldiers vaccinating civilians, airlifting supplies to isolated areas after an earthquake. If you look at the topic, opposition has to stand by military intervention beyond just domestic disasters. Opposition only wants to fund aid for the Red Cross. Not only are they overstepping their fiat for this, but even if they're not, we offer this aid as well. There is no opportunity cost when it comes to funding pandemic aid, helping victims of bombings and other humanitarian crisis. Panel, two substantive points for you tonight. Firstly, on why foreign military is best placed to deliver aid. Secondly, why military intervention would end armed conflict sooner. But firstly, a responsive point on the question of escalation. So, more specifically, whether military intervention escalates conflicts. So we thought, firstly, this occurred in two separate circumstances, like natural disasters, in which there would be this doesn't happen, there is no escalation of conflicts. And secondly, in man-made conflicts, this looks like wars. And we thought that this, alternatively creates a precedent where would-be invaders now know that they're going to face military intervention unlike before, and this plays into the calculus in deciding whether they would invade a country or not.
Point of information.
No, thank you. This would occur less. We thought when we militarily intervene, we do not think this looks like US offering hundreds of thousands of troops to Ukraine to fight Russia directly. We thought this looked like peacekeeping, protecting hospitals with vulnerable people inside and protecting civilians. And also in cases where it necessitates... Yep.
When you say we're sending people to hospitals, when you send Australian soldiers to defend a hospital in Ukraine and then the Russians are tasked to capture that hospital, do not Australian soldiers then shoot Russian soldiers?
Yeah, well, in this situation, this is what I was coming to, in cases where it necessitates this frontline direct conflict, the looming threat of military intervention is going to act as a deterrent for these Russians, and it's going to de-escalate the conflict. And now onto my first substantive point of why foreign militaries were best placed to deliver emergency aid in hostile countries. So firstly, as you heard at first, we thought there was a principled obligation to do so, where when you were a foreign country, with the military capacity to assist in instances of humanitarian crises, we thought that an obligation existed to do so. We also thought that, in situations where there is a hostile government, this looks like, no thank you, often dictatorships in which these people have no obligation to care for their civilians. Therefore, there is an obligation for foreign countries with the capacity to do so to intervene in their stead. And also, this whole question of why foreign militaries were principally justified to override the sovereignty of hostile countries. We thought in the situation of man-made conflict, where there are dictatorships, they're unconcerned about the welfare of their civilians. And we thought even with natural disasters, they didn't care when people were starving in a famine or dying of a disease. And in these instances where dictatorships were committing crimes against their own people, they weren't going to be open to foreign interventions. However, even in these instances, we thought it was justified to intervene where countries were hostile to aid because the actions of these countries were representative of that dictator, not every innocent civilian suffering as a result of their decision. These people, the civilians, had no agency and they shouldn't suffer. Although we note that generally this would be a minor proportion of exclusively man-made instances of conflict, as every country who are experiencing a humanitarian crisis from a natural disaster would be accepting of aid. And secondly, this question of why military interventions were going to end armed conflicts sooner. We thought that under the status quo, militaries offered physical troops in armed conflicts. This meant that global security was rested on regional organisations like NATO and the African Union. Yeah, I'll take you.
How effective would you say the US intervention in Iraq was at de-escalating conflict?
Well, to the extent that it's principally justified, we would accept that intervention. Intervention would have been effective in escalating the conflict. So we say that when countries start offering emergency aid in the form of troops, a precedent of mutually assured destruction is set on the long term, and that is exactly why Russia didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. So we essentially are creating an infinite expansion of NATO to the extent that wars occur less frequently. And we now create an atmosphere in which would-be invaders are forced to weigh up the risk of military intervention in the decision-making of whether they invade a country or not. Ladies and gentlemen, it was because we were the side tonight that could prove that foreign militaries are best placed to deliver foreign aid and why military interventions would end armed conflict sooner that we took this debate. Thank you.
Panel, opposition lost this debate at first when they tell you that the only thing that separated a military and an NGO was the military's unique capability to launch amphibious assaults. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition's case was no longer about humanitarian aid. It was about Australia becoming the global warmonger and becoming involved in every dispute that they felt they should be. Two questions responsive here and then two substantive. Firstly, on this idea why opposition's case directly involved Australia in foreign wars. They tell you at first that the Australian military should be deployed to defend Ukrainian hospitals, and then also, and I'll get to this in a minute, tell you at second that Australia has an obligation to go in, coup the government who isn't supporting their own citizens, and letting them starve or whatever, and install their own government. That was wrong, and I'll get to that in a second. But they tell you that Australia should just deploy its military to active war zones to defend Ukrainian hospitals. We tell you in a POI why this is so damaging, and that is that when Russian soldiers are tasked to capture a Ukrainian hospital and Australian soldiers are defending it, there has to be a conflict, right? All of a sudden, Russian soldiers have to shoot Australian soldiers and Australian soldiers will shoot back. What that is like a blatant declaration of war. There was three things wrong here. Firstly, this was just like a declaration of war, no matter how the opposition wanted to spin it. When Australians started shooting Russians, it was war. This was so dangerous. This, again, fell down because their own principle is this idea that we, limit suffering. No, thank you, limit suffering. What they neglect here is that now Russia, a superpower, is at war with another, first world large power like Australia. What this meant was thousands of dead civilians, direct attacks on Australia from Russia, and direct combat between these militaries. What they failed to realise in their own case is that all they do is just perpetuate global war by making Australia stick their fingers in every single pie that was available. No, thank you. Secondly, the military training wasn't humanitarian training, and this is what they missed here. That the humanitarian and NGO organisations had a unique ability that the military didn't have, because the military was trained in military operations, not humanitarian operations. And as we tell you at first, these groups are already involved in the community, these NGOs, they're already generally accepted. No, thank you. You know who isn't accepted in a war-torn country? The military. So we didn't think that Australia was all of a sudden going to have an insane capability. Finally here is this fact that NGOs and UN volunteers aren't actually a threat to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? The Russians, actually I'll take you in a second. The Russians do not shoot NGO workers because they don't pose a threat. You know who they do shoot? Australian soldiers. Let's hear it.
Then why are Russia consistently shelling the hospitals of UNICEF and NGOs across Ukraine as we speak right now?
Okay, there was a couple of things here. We think that Russia's actions aren't indicative of every single conflict, and even if they were, at the point where UNICEF hospitals were being bombed, it was no better to send the Australian army in. All you were doing was just Australia declaring war on Russia. The outcomes for these civilians never changed. Now onto this idea of the weird principle that we hear at second, which is a principle justification to override governments who didn't look after their own citizens. We thought there was just, from a team perspective, there was just a lot wrong here. So now we hear at second their case comes out that really Australia should declare war on every single global country who's hostile to their own citizens. What this looked like was Australia, who had a relatively small military, saying, yeah, let's go after Russia, let's go after China, let's go after North Korea, they're all mean to their citizens. This was so incredibly damaging for a team that told you that they limited global suffering. And again, you'll hear about this more later, why there isn't even public support for this in the first place. But no one in the Australian public thinks that we should be bringing back tens of thousands of dead Australians when we send them off to far corners of the world to fight a war that probably isn't even justified in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, their case was damaging from the beginning. Into substantive here. So firstly, why this lacked support, and there's two stages to this. Firstly, domestically. Australians generally weren't fans of sending young soldiers overseas and making them having them come back in body bags. We saw this in the Afghanistan conflict. We think this would, and I'll take you in a second, we think this would be replicated when you send Australians to Australian military personnel to every corner of the world to be involved in this humanitarian crisis. Yes.
You've talked a lot in this speech about the declaration of war against huge powers. Where does your side stand on the British declaring war on Nazi Germany?
We think okay, there's just a totally different example here. Nazi Germany is a country that just goes out, invades other countries, but also invades a country which the United Kingdom has an alliance with, your Poland is allied to the United Kingdom, they say that they're going to stand with them, they then declare war when they're allied. There was a total difference here because no countries had a military alliance to Ukraine as much as the opposition want to claim. This was a different war, this was just an example which did fell through in this debate. So we know domestically now that this lacks support. Internationally, this also lacks support because the man in Ghana, when he saw the Australian army march in, Like, he was already scared of his own military was going to harm him. He was now also scared when guys with guns wearing camouflage uniform came in. He was unlikely to ask for help from the military. He was unlikely to, engage in the opposition's vaccination programs when he saw them carrying around machine guns, right? What the opposition actually got was more suffering. You know who they would approach? They would approach these NGOs. They would approach, the United Nations, because they were already so, inbuilt and entrenched in this community. The point to take away here is that domestically, there is no support for this foreign intervention and foreign interference. And actually, what it did is create less aid, because Australians sat there and said, no, we shouldn't be sending our aid to Ukraine because we're already sending, young Australians' lives. We're already trading that in. So why would we send more aid? This was actually directly damaging to these countries, and created a system where less aid was sent from Australia. And internationally, the support was limited here, and actually there was a lack of engagement from the people the opposition wanted to help so badly. Finally, this policy, it's for these reasons. Firstly, that we directly stopped Australia becoming in foreign wars. How the principal justification which the opposition brings you at second is just blatantly wrong and harms their case. And finally, that there was no support for this policy in the first place, that we took this debate.
The opposition lied to you when they told you that Russia wasn't attacking hospitals. They lied to you when they said we can't fund all the humanitarian aid that they can. And they lied to you when they said that Australia had no moral obligations to foreign governments, but in the same breath have the nerve to tell you that they had a unique obligation to offer monetary support. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Look at one, who was the principally justified side. Secondly, look at were militaries best equipped to offer humanitarian aid. And thirdly, look at this question of did military intervention lead to military escalation. Moving on to this principal point. We gave you this principle that foreign governments had a moral obligation to do everything in their power to minimise suffering. We said that the deployability of militaries was actually a benefit under our side of the house, and we say that this obligation exists regardless of the efficacy. The obligation wasn't to stop the Rwandan genocide, it was an obligation to try, and so this is directly responsive to their claim of practical contingency of our side. It's actually not. If Australia could offer one soldier to defend a Ukrainian hospital, that was worth it. The opposition offer a counter-principle that Australia had obligations to its own citizens. We have, there are two things here. One, they said that they're willing to deploy the army to flood-affected towns in Queensland. They fail their burden when they say this because, looking at the topic, we should deploy the military to deliver humanitarian aid. We don't think they can stand by this aid domestically. Secondly, they say that the obligation to help foreign countries to minimise suffering didn't actually exist. The Australian government had no obligation, but in the same breath say that they're going to offer monetary support. In a POI, when asked about the specific principled difference or the specific principled obligation difference under Australia helping other countries, we hear a pretty poor response, to be honest, to the effect that Australia did have obligations to foreign states, but military intervention will escalate and monetary aid won't. So the opposition's principle is actually practically contingent, and our principle of foreign governments doing everything in their power to minimise suffering still stood. Moving on to this second question of were militaries well equipped to offer humanitarian aid? Yes.
The obligation wasn't for was for Australia to help, not for the military specifically to help.
Okay, so we think that the military, as a branch of the Australian government, was actually the best actor to allow the Australia as a country to offer that help, and we tell you this later in our point as to why the military was the best equipped organisation to offer humanitarian aid. But note, when you say that the Australian government had no obligation to offer support to other countries, but you actually want to offer monetary aid, and you want to talk about, in your principle, the inefficacy of offering the military as a support mechanism, your principle of only offering money is actually a practically contingent principle. Ours of just broadly trying to support other countries to minimise suffering wasn't a practically contingent principle, and that's why we take it, and it still stood at the end of this debate. Moving on to the second question of were militaries well equipped to offer humanitarian aid in the first place? We gave you three specific things. One, the deployability of militaries was a benefit exclusive to our side of the house. Secondly, the huge advances in technology that have been made over the past 30 years meant that militaries were the most technologically advanced organisations in the entire world. Thirdly, we said that militaries had a high capacity to work with other organisations, like humanitarian organisations like the Red Cross. Note, we think that NGOs and humanitarian organisations have done this in the past, say with the Ebola outbreak, no thank you, when UN peacekeepers were actually involved in the deployment to actually keep a stable border around the outbreak zone. They actually worked with the World Health Organization, and also under this point of humanitarian organizations, we say that we can fund it just as well as they can, no thank you, and military support can exist under our side of the house in conjunction with military support. And so finally they tell you that Russians don't really shell UNICEF hospitals. They literally do. That was a blatant lie. No, thank you. But when we actually offered Australian soldiers and more UN peacekeepers, which were a type of military officer, that actually acted as a deterrent, rather, for the Russian military to attack that hospital, that still stood at the end of this debate, and we were still able to fund humanitarian organisations to the extent that the opposition were. Sure.
If Australia has already faced cyber attacks by Russia simply for sanctioning their invasion of Ukraine, what do you think the response will be to the military being deployed?
We don't think Russia actually has a large capacity to respond to Australia any more than they actually have through these cyber attacks. We think that when Australia actually goes to Ukraine, offers support and defends Ukrainian hospitals, it doesn't look like hundreds of thousands of Australians going to the front line. That was a massive straw man. We actually think this is a very situational circumstance. For example, we're more than willing to put people on the front line in, say, Rwanda if it meant that the killing of their citizens was minimised if the Australian government was to send soldiers. But we think in the case of Ukraine, it would primarily look like more peacekeeping operations as opposed to actually putting people on the border. So moving out of this question of escalation, they strawman and say that Australia declares war on pretty much every country ever. No, we tell you it looks like peacekeeping, and it's actually really situational. I've just addressed that. And there were really two main branches of escalation, or types of disasters, rather, that this applied to. First of all was natural disasters. We didn't actually think any escalation would happen in these situations because when Nepal had a massive earthquake, which led to a bunch of avalanches, that government was more than willing to accept military aid from Australia. So any escalation that did come had to come in the form of a response to a man-made disaster, like a war. So we tell you at second that this would actually create a precedent that would-be invaders know that they'll face military intervention if they declare war on another country. And so we say under our side of the house, you essentially get mutually assured destruction to a larger extent, and so countries are less likely to declare war on each other. So when we militarily intervene, we don't think it looks like the US offering hundreds of thousands of troops to fight Russia directly. It looks like peacekeeping, like defending hospitals and civilians. It essentially works in this case, that the military goes to Ukraine. We think it actually acts primarily as a de-escalation mechanism. So at the end of the speech, I've proven a few things. One, we met our principled obligation of Australia actually helping these foreign governments to the best extent possible, and it wasn't a practically contingent principle. Secondly, the deployability, the technology, and the capacity to work with other organisations exclusive to our side of the house meant that militaries were best placed to offer humanitarian aid. And thirdly, this didn't actually escalate, but improved diplomatic relations across the world that we take this debate.
The opposition aims to end all wars by creating the exact same cobweb of alliances and obligations that led to both of the world wars. This just didn't make sense at all. Two questions in tonight's debate. The first on which side reduced suffering the most, and the second on which side was best equipped to deal with humanitarian crises. But first on the principle clash, the opposition brought up a principle about the obligation to minimise suffering. As they even acknowledged, this was entirely practically contingent and hence is addressed as such. At first, we told you that the military, our principle was that the military was not fulfilling its own role in dealing with these crises and doing foreign interventions, and that it was principally justified for NGOs and government monetary aid to be supplied instead. Note that they completely lied about what our principle was. It was not that we had an obligation to our own citizens. They completely imagined our principle and rebutted that instead, and because theirs was practically contingent, ours was the only one that stood principally. No, thank you. So, on this point about which side reduces the most suffering, we told you that when the military intervened, you escalated conflict. We told you that we would do it diplomatically through NGOs and through monetary aid to these nations. No, thank you. So, let's take a look at two examples to see how they'll play out, because there were two fundamentally different examples. Yes, there were the wars, but there were also natural disasters. Note that natural disasters such as earthquakes, the opposition completely ignored throughout the whole debate, even denying that they would get involved whenever we brought them up. They said they weren't in the scope. They completely ignored them. No, thank you. So, for example, with an earthquake, on the AF, they would send in soldiers who do not speak the language and who don't know the local place and the local people, and therefore locals are going to be far more unwilling to seek help from them because they see big foreign muscly men with guns coming to help them, right? On our side, we actually have these NGOs who are already there, no thank you, and they would be more empowered through our government aid to effectively deal with the situation. The locals would be far more willing in getting help from them, and the NGOs would be far more knowledgeable in doing it because, no thank you, cruise missiles don't stop tsunamis, right? The military provided no additional function there. So onto this second, and I'll take you on a second, broader example of things like the Rwandan genocide.
If a missile didn't stop a tsunami, why did your side stand by the Australian military going to the Queensland flood-affected towns?
We stood by the military going there in the sense that it was our own nation and that we were obligated to do as much as we could, but we didn't stand by the military going off to Haiti to help with an earthquake when there were far more things available. And we would note that as a first port of call, we would send the NGOs and aid to the flood-affected regions in eastern New South Wales. So, onto this part about the Rwandan genocide. As we told you at second, the opposition would turn the Rwandan genocide into the Rwandan civil war, right? Because the invasion of foreign militaries was inevitable, they would, of course, ignore all of the red flags that were leading up to the outbreak of the conflict. On our side, the reason the genocide escalated was because the Western world categorically failed to respond to signs of aggressions between Rwandans, right? On our side of the house, because the NGOs and the governments were more empowered, they would be able to stop these things more preemptively because, no thank you, it's important to note that the opposition is literally warmongers. They are creating the same situations that the US did in the Middle East where they went in with humanitarian aid and destabilised entire regions, killing millions of people. And further to this, the op actually made no reasonable difference between Ukraine and the Rwandan genocide, right? And the quick note on this Ukrainian point was that they had such a large tension where at the same time as they would only be sending in a few hundred soldiers to defend a hospital, they were also supposed to be a massive deterrent to one of the largest militaries on earth in Russia. That just didn't add up. The opposition wasn't able to get either benefit that they talked about, right? Therefore, we clearly reduced the amount of people dying the most. Yes?
We say it's situational, but outside of the house can easily fund NGOs and humanitarian organisations to the same extent you can, but you can't deploy the military.
I'm getting into this right now. Which side was best equipped? Because the op has this point, right, about mutual exclusivity. But the only mutually exclusive stuff that they get is that they're spending half their money on javelin missiles, right, and bullets, whereas we actually fund that money into NGOs and organisations that are actually going to be helping, right? Because it's pretty obvious that when we decrease the military fundings in some part in terms of them going over into foreign lands, we were going to be able to increase these NGO budgets. That was pretty obviously true, that we were always going to be able to get more funding to these organisations than the opposition, and we were going to be able to order the military to give them these same necessary equipment because the opposition was only making arbitrary differences in, the US military technically is the only people to have this robot, therefore the NGOs could never have it. We could give it to them. They could be equipped even better than the military. We were the most equipped side. We were the side that reduced the most suffering. We were the principally justified side. We took this debate.